basically, as I mentioned, you have data object and you're importing the actual class data object from a module called data object. So once you have access to this is a way to reference different objects already created or libraries that you may have imported or utilized from some other sources of code from the internet or downloaded or whatever. This is a way essentially to create more sophisticated software by referencing libraries or existing code somewhere else. So we've done this in this case, code that I've created that we'll talk about later. Now we're going to do something called inheritance. Inheritance is a way to essentially create a class that builds off of another class. So to access functionality within a class, sometimes you want to inherit those functionalities into a class. So basically it's a way to create a class that has more than the functionality you create in that class. So imagine creating something that has 5 functions, but by referencing another sort of class, essentially another object eventually, you are potentially adding, say, up to 10 methods or even more. So it's a way to create more sophisticated code by essentially allowing us to create more sophisticated kinds of objects, referencing more code, essentially. Okay, so you will see that in this case we've created again the init sort of constructor, which is referencing in this case a z value. X and y, you notice this time, are not being added to the self. That is, instead of creating a self.x and y, you can see data object init is being referenced. That is the constructor of data object. So if we go to data object real quick, we'll see that, oops, sorry about that, created access the wrong executable. It has this sort of x and y inputs, right? So that is what's being referenced by this, okay? So now we're accessing the constructor of another object through our init constructor. So we're creating a new variable called z, but we're also accessing another constructor to create or to utilize that constructor. So we now have 3 variables, x, y, and z. 2 of those variables are actually referenced in another object. Okay, so that's how that constructor works. Now, after that, what you can see is that we see some referencing going on. We have what's essentially a way to input values. This is not necessarily utilized code. Sometimes in Python or object-oriented programming, you may want to have something called setters and getters. Essentially, setters and getters are ways to set values and get values. Sometimes those values need to be changed. You want to have a method to set those values and then get those values. So this is a method that we've created called myz, to a way to reference to get z later on. This is again not necessary. It's not actually that important, so I won't talk about it in detail. It's just an optional thing to do when you're doing objects. Now, what is happening is the method that we'll be using is this add xyz. It's referencing the object, once again, self. Here you can see it's getting an a variable. So an a variable was something that was created, essentially a new kind of variable that's created. So when we do self, we can create new variables in reference to the object. So what we're saying is that add data. So add data is actually coming from our other object. So remember, we are now in child data. But add data is referenced to in actually something that's in this in the data object. So that is the parent or the object that we're using inheriting in child data. So you can see the method basically adds x and y. That's what that method does. So in child data, we're getting that method. So it adds x and y, and we're saying add it to z. So essentially what we're doing is building or constructing that method so that it does an additional function. Okay, which is add x, y, and z. And then in this case, we're then returning that value a. So return self.a, which is the value that now is referenced through the addition of add data and adding z.